Guys, the week has arrived with a new episode of Star Trek, Strange New Worlds, and this time they decided to put the entire thing in black and white. I was like, what? But honestly, after watching it, I think the black and white style was probably the least interesting thing about this episode. Because buried underneath all that noir, all the disguises, the resistance story, and the return of one very familiar Klingon, Strange New Worlds may have quietly revealed something about Kor that completely changes how we should look at him. And this is the part one really want to get into today. Because after almost 60 years of knowing Kor as one of Star Trek's most recognizable Klingons, Episode 4 gives us a version of this character we've never really seen before. Not the legendary Kor. Not the Kor who eventually faces Kirk. Not the Klingon warrior we already know from the original series. This is the man before the legend. And I think there's a reason the show chose to show us this version of him now. So today, we're going to break down what Episode 4 actually reveals about Kor, why his actions are more important than his appearance, and the one detail that may explain why the Kor we eventually meet in the original series became the man we remember. Because I don't think Star Trek just brought Kor back for nostalgia. I think they just showed us something we've been missing for nearly 6 decades. And once you see it, some of Kor's future behavior starts making a lot more sense. The first thing that caught my attention is how completely comfortable Kor is with power. And that's easy to overlook because, well, he's Kor. He's a Klingon commander. Of course he's intimidating. Of course he has authority. Of course people are afraid of him. But Episode 4 gives us another layer to that authority. Kor isn't simply another Klingon officer who happens to be in charge. We're given a much stronger connection between him and the upper levels of Klingon society. His house has a connection to the Klingon Imperial Family. And suddenly, his behavior starts looking very different, because now we're not just looking at a warrior who climbed his way up through the ranks. We're looking at someone whose relationship with power may have been built into his identity from the beginning. And that matters a lot, because Kor doesn't behave like a man who is constantly trying to prove that he belongs. He behaves like someone who believes he already belongs at the top. There's a confidence to him that goes beyond military rank. When he's dealing with the people on Matar 12, he doesn't act like he's negotiating with equals. He acts like Klingon authority is simply the natural order of things. The planet is occupied. There is a resistance. People are hiding information. And Kor's response isn't to understand why they're resisting. It's to crush the resistance before it becomes a bigger problem. That's not just military strategy. That's a worldview. And this is where I think the episode becomes much more interesting than it initially appears. Because Strange New Worlds could have brought back an original Klingon character and told exactly the same story. Instead, they chose Kor. Why? Because we already know what Kor eventually becomes. We know the future. We know he'll encounter Kirk. We know he'll become one of the Klingon figures most closely associated with the early Federation Klingon conflict. So the writers don't have to convince us that Kor is important. They can do something much more interesting. They can show us how that version of Kor was created. Look at how Kor treats information. That's where the mind sifter becomes important. At first, it feels like a classic Star Trek callback. You see that device and immediately think of the original series. It's familiar. It's creepy. It's very Klingon. But I think there's more going on. Because a mind sifter tells us something about Kor's relationship with control. Kor doesn't simply want people to obey him. He wants to know what they're thinking. He wants information that people haven't willingly given him. He doesn't want uncertainty. And that is a huge part of his character. Because a person who needs complete certainty will eventually start treating privacy as a threat. If you don't tell Kor what he wants to know, he doesn't simply accept that you have the right to keep it from him. He finds another way to get it. And that's exactly what makes the mind sifter so revealing. It's not just a weapon. It's an expression of his worldview. Control the situation. Control the information. Control the people. And if you think about Kor's eventual reputation, that suddenly fits. The Kor we know from the original series is incredibly confident in Klingon power. He believes in conquest. He believes in strength. He believes the Klingon Empire has every right to impose its will when it has the power to do so. Episode 4 doesn't suddenly explain his entire personality, but it gives us a younger version of the belief system that eventually defines him. And then there's Una. This is where I think the episode gets even smarter, because Una is basically the perfect person to put opposite Kor. She spends her life hiding part of who she is. She's an Illyrian serving in Starfleet, and she has already experienced what happens when society decides that your identity makes you dangerous. Now she lands on a world where she's immediately mistaken for another woman. A woman who is deeply involved in the political situation there. And suddenly, Una has to walk around inside someone else's identity. That sounds like a fun noir setup. But thematically, it's almost too perfect. Because Kor and Una represent completely different relationships with identity. Kor has power because of where he belongs. Una has had to hide part of where she belongs. Kor represents inherited authority. Una represents someone who had to fight to be accepted by the institution she chose. And when those two characters eventually collide, there's a deeper conflict underneath the surface. Kor looks at people and sees their place in a hierarchy. Una looks at people and understands what it feels like to be judged because of something they cannot change. That's why I don't think Kor's background is just random lore. The episode is putting his identity directly against Una's. And that makes his connection to the Klingon Imperial Family much more important. Because if your family is tied to the highest levels of Klingon society, then the Empire isn't just the government you serve. It's your inheritance. It's your history. It's your identity. And suddenly Kor's obsession with protecting Klingon authority becomes much easier to understand. He may genuinely believe he's protecting something that belongs to him. Not personally, but culturally, historically, even morally, from his perspective. And that's what makes him dangerous. Because the most interesting villains aren't the ones who know they're evil. They're the ones who genuinely believe they're doing the right thing. Kor doesn't need to wake up every morning thinking, I'm going to be the villain today. He can believe that maintaining Klingon control is honorable. He can believe that rebellion is dishonorable. He can believe that extracting information from prisoners is justified. He can believe that strength gives the Klingon Empire the right to rule. And if he believes all of that, then his actions suddenly become much more understandable. Not acceptable, but understandable. And I think that is exactly what Strange New Worlds is doing with him. It's not rewriting Kor. It's showing us the foundation, because there's still one detail about his appearance in Episode 4 that I can't get out of my head. The show didn't just bring back Kor. It brought him back at the exact point where Star Trek can begin showing us the man who eventually becomes the legend. And if that's intentional, then the question isn't whether Kor has a secret. The bigger question is whether we've misunderstood what made him so dangerous in the first place. Because maybe Kor's greatest weapon was never the mind sifter. Maybe it was the belief that he was entitled to use it. And this is where I think the episode gets much more interesting. Because if Kor's real weakness is his obsession with control, then the mind sifter isn't actually the most important thing we saw. It's what the mind sifter tells us about him. Kor believes that if he can control what people know, what they say, and eventually even what they think, then he can control the entire situation. And for most of the episode, that belief seems to work. People are afraid of him. The resistance has to operate in secret. Everyone around him has to be careful. But then the episode starts quietly proving Kor wrong. He doesn't actually know what's happening around him. And that's the part one think we were supposed to notice. Because Kor believes he's surrounded by people he understands. He's not. People are lying to him. People are hiding things from him. People are working against him. And most importantly, he doesn't see it coming. That's a pretty significant flaw for a character whose entire reputation is built around being in control. And it makes the title Kor's Biggest Lie much more interesting. Because maybe the lie isn't something Kor tells everyone else. Maybe it's the lie he tells himself. That his power means he understands everything. It doesn't. And Uhura is probably the clearest example of that. Kor uses the mind sifter because he believes he can simply force the truth out of her. He doesn't need to persuade her. He doesn't need to understand her. He doesn't even need her cooperation. He believes he can take the information he wants. And that's very revealing. Because this isn't really about the technology. It's about Kor's philosophy. If someone refuses to give him what he wants, he doesn't see that refusal as something he has to respect. He sees it as an obstacle. And that's exactly how he approaches the resistance. He doesn't try to understand why these people are resisting Klingon rule. He sees resistance itself as the problem. So the solution is control, more surveillance, more intimidation, more punishment, more force. And that tells us something important about the Kor we're eventually going to meet. His confidence isn't simply the confidence of a warrior. It's the confidence of someone who genuinely believes that his side has the right to decide what happens. That's why his connection to Klingon power matters so much. If Kor has grown up close to the highest levels of Klingon society, then his belief in that hierarchy isn't something he picked up yesterday. It's part of the world he understands. To him, the Klingon Empire isn't just a government. It's the natural order. And if that's how you see the world, then rebellion doesn't look like another political opinion. It looks like chaos. It looks like disrespect. It looks like weakness. And suddenly, Kor's behavior makes a lot more sense. He's not necessarily thinking, I'm going to be cruel. He's thinking, I'm restoring order. That's a much more dangerous mindset. Because once somebody convinces themselves that their actions are necessary to preserve order, almost anything can become justified. And I think Episode 4 gives us a very early version of that mentality. But here's where the episode really gets clever. The story puts Kor against people who understand something he doesn't. You don't defeat control by becoming stronger than the person controlling you. Sometimes you defeat it by becoming impossible to control. That's what the Resistance is doing. That's what Una is doing through her deception. And, in a completely different way, that's what Uhura does. Kor has all the official power, but information keeps slipping through his fingers. And that's why the episode's title, A Case of Chiaroscuro, becomes more interesting. Everything is presented through contrasts. Light and darkness, truth and deception, identity and disguise, power and resistance. And Kor is sitting right in the middle of that. He thinks everything is simple. He thinks he knows who the enemy is. But the episode keeps showing us that people aren't nearly as easy to categorize as he believes. Una is pretending to be someone else. The Resistance is hiding in plain sight. People inside Kor's own operation aren't necessarily loyal. And Uhura isn't the helpless prisoner he assumes she is. That's a pretty brutal lesson for someone like Kor, because his entire system depends on certainty. He needs to know who is loyal. He needs to know who is dangerous. He needs to know who has information. But the more he tries to control everyone, the more everyone has a reason to hide from him. And that could explain something about the Kor we eventually see in the original series. He becomes incredibly confident in Klingon power. He repeatedly assumes that the Empire's strength will eventually overwhelm its opponents. But we've now seen the weakness underneath that confidence. Kor can control a room. He can intimidate people. He can command soldiers. But he can't completely control what people believe. And he definitely can't control what people choose to do when they're willing to risk everything.